Alright guys, so today we're going to be making kind of a hypothetical video. This video today is going to be a worst case scenario for President Donald Trump going into 2020. So we're going to get right into it. We'll give the candidates their safe states. But basically what this video is going to be about, this is going to be examining what a worst case scenario for Donald Trump going into 2020 looks like. And some people could say, well, this is very outlandish, and it is. That's the point. This is an absolute, well, not absolute, but this is a worst case scenario for Donald Trump. Now, let's just say hypothetically, coronavirus isn't resolved by November, or it comes back with a combination of poor leadership and, let's just say, a Joe Biden surge. Somehow, Joe Biden starts surging in the polls going into election night. This is what we could expect to see. Now, I don't think this is going to happen, but given the uncertain times we're in, I almost think that almost anything's possible when it comes to 2020. If you'd asked me a month ago, I would have said Donald Trump has this race in the bag. There's a 90% chance he wins 2020. Now I put that more at a 60-40 chance for Donald Trump, but this is a worst case scenario video for Donald Trump. So these are all the safe states. The gray states are states that are going to be in play. Now, instead of doing all the states by likely, lean, and tilt, I'd rather do it in order from left to right. So we're going to start with the state of Nevada. If we look at Obama's victory in Nevada in 2008, he won it by nearly a safe margin. And if we look at the past election results from Nevada, Republicans have not been favored. In fact, they've lost control of the state government. They have no statewide officials, I believe. They might have a Secretary of State in Nevada, but no, they have no governorships, obviously. They have no senators, and they've lost the state legislature. So let's just say in a worst case scenario, I could see Nevada going to Joe Biden by a likely margin, which is anywhere from 7 to 15 points. I tend to say even in a worst case scenario, it's going to be at the lower end. Most Republicans lose Nevada by around 5 points, but assuming turnout is high and some Trump voters either stay home or vote for Joe Biden. And again, even in a partisan climate like we're in now, when earth-shattering events happen in a campaign, it is possible. Now, again, I don't think this is actually going to happen, but this is just a worst-case scenario. Of course, in a worst-case scenario, Arizona would go to Joe Biden by a lean margin. Trump would lose Arizona in a worst-case scenario by a lean margin, probably around the 2 to 3% range. We saw in 2018, what's her face? We saw Kirsten Sinema beat Martha McSally in 2018 by around 2.5 points or so. So let's just say in this hypothetical, Trump would probably lose Arizona by a similar margin, if not slightly more. In a worst case scenario, the state of New Mexico would be a safe state for Joe Biden, and the state of Colorado would go by a likely margin. Now, Colorado has already been trending blue for a long time. President Obama won Colorado by a likely margin, and he also won New Mexico by a safe margin. Now, I'm not saying Joe Biden would have the amount of enthusiasm that Barack Obama did, but with a lot of voters disillusioned with President Trump in this hypothetical, they might turn to Joe Biden, and also many Trump voters might stay home. Again, these are states that are already trending Democratic here. New Mexico is a blue state. Colorado is essentially a blue state now. Nevada is just beginning that consolidation of Democratic strength in the state, and Arizona likewise is on the earlier end of transforming into a state that in the long term trends for the Democrats. Now we go to the state of Texas. Texas, again, is a state that is getting a lot closer in recent elections. We saw in 2018 Beto O'Rourke only lose the state in a statewide Senate race that had national attention by around 2.5 points. So with that being said, we take in all accounts. I think even in a worst case scenario for President Trump, I don't see him losing the state of Texas in 2020. I see Texas going to Trump by a lean margin. I would say around 4 points or so, 3 or 4 points, similar to a more Beto margin, maybe even 2.5 on the really lower end. Again, we're talking worst case scenario. It's very unlikely that Texas is that close in 2020. So moving on, we're going to move up north to Minnesota. In a worst case scenario, Joe Biden will take the state of Minnesota by a likely margin, anywhere from 7 to 15 points. In a scenario like this, I would put it in around the 10 or 11 point range. Joe Biden getting around 54% of the vote to Donald Trump's 44 or something like that. Similar to margins we saw in 2012 and 2008 from Minnesota. Moving down south to Iowa. This is a tough one to call. Trump won Iowa by 10 points last time. That's not an easy margin to overcome. But I think in a worst case scenario, Trump would win the state, but by a tilt margin. He'd win it by around less than 2 points, if it ever got that close. The state of Wisconsin is another state that would be close in either scenario. But of course, in a worst case, it would go to Joe Biden by a likely, a lean margin, anywhere from 2 to 7 points, probably on the higher end. And even states like even races like the governor's race in Wisconsin were very close. But this is counting on a Joe Biden surge in the polls. Michigan would go to Joe Biden by a likely margin. High African American turnout in the state, low rural turnout, flips the state tremendously for the Democrats this time around, and gives Joe Biden a big boost. I forgot to put Indiana as safe red. That's going to stay that way. Now, the state of Ohio has had a close governor's race in 2018, but not as close as, say, in Georgia or Florida. But even in a worst-case scenario, again, with a margin around 9 points, I think Trump would still win the state of Ohio, but by only a tilt margin, anywhere from 2 points or below that. So it's going to be fairly close. Nebraska second. We might as well get to that before we forget. Joe Biden would take by a lean margin in a worst-case scenario. This puts Joe Biden at 250 electoral votes to Trump's 187. Moving east to Pennsylvania, Joe Biden will take Pennsylvania by a lean margin, probably similar to what we saw in 2012, taking around 51% of the vote to Donald Trump's 46%. Now in New Hampshire, in a worst-case scenario, as it has gotten fairly close recently, I put New Hampshire in the lean column for Joe Biden. Probably a similar 50-45 or 51-46%. Now, the state of Maine at large would go back to the Democrats by a stronger margin, a likely margin. And the second congressional district would go to Donald Trump by a lean margin, only a few points, whereas the rest, the first congressional district, would still go by a safe margin. Now, Virginia is a state that's already trending very much in the blue column, but I think even at this stage in the race, and even in a worst-case scenario for Donald Trump, I think the race would be roughly within 10 points, which would put it in the likely and not the safe column by my scaling. So Virginia will still be likely for the Democrats, but I'd say it'd be on the higher end. In 2017, the governor's race was around a 9-point difference, with Ralph Northam getting 53% of the vote to Ed Gillespie's 45%. It would probably be a slightly larger margin against Trump. Trump only got 44.9% of the vote in 2016 here. It might have been a little less, but I know it was around 44%. So we could see even worse than that. It could be like 43 to 54 or something like that. So anywhere from 10 to 11 points would probably be the margin of difference. Now, of course, in a worst-case scenario, North Carolina would also flip for the Democrats. This, I think, would be by a very tiny margin. This would be a tilt margin for sure. Like the governor's race was only by 0.2% in 2016 in favor of Roy Cooper, who's the Democratic governor of North Carolina. I think even in a worst-case scenario, it would not be a resounding victory for the Democrats, as I think there are more Trump loyalists in the state of North Carolina than in these Rust Belt states. And North Carolina is a traditionally Southern conservative state overall. So this would be by a much smaller margin. Now, again, I'm just speculating, and this is very far out. But that's what I would see in a worst-case scenario. Now, again, the state of Georgia is a state that has gotten very close in recent years. Particularly in 2016, we saw a 5% difference between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. Donald Trump edging out Hillary by 5 points, and then current governor Brian Kemp beating Stacey Abrams, I believe, by 1.5 points. I think it was that close. It was actually 1.5 points or so. So let's just say in a worst case scenario, Democratic turnout is equal, if not higher to that. However, I don't see the state going to the Democrats in 2020. Even in a worst case, I would put Georgia in the tilt Republican column, similar to Ohio and Iowa. This would probably be neck and neck, with Joe Biden getting around 49% of the vote and Donald Trump getting 0.5 or so higher than him. This would be a very close margin. Now, lastly, we go to Florida. Florida being a much closer state than these others. In a worst case scenario, it would go to Joe Biden by a lean margin. That puts the race at 334 electoral votes for Joe Biden to 204 votes for Donald Trump. Now, this again is a worst case scenario. I can't stress it enough. This is not my actual opinion, but this is just speculating off the top of my head of what I think would happen in a worst case scenario. Anyway, guys, thanks for watching this video. I will make a best case scenario video for Donald Trump following this. So if this was too blackpilling for you, you can go check out that video. But please like and subscribe to the channel and come back again for more content.